Yeah, you swallow that, you fucker. You drink that down. You don't fucking spit that out. Yeah, you like it, you fucker. Drink it. Fucking swallow that fucking... Fuck?
If I was going to make a list of sequels that I think get dunked on a bit harder than they deserve, F.E.A.R 2 would have to go towards the top. Despite actually making what I think are a few clear improvements over its predecessor and being a very fun shooter in its own right, people stomped this one into the fucking dirt. And I had to be sure I didn't have my nostalgia goggles on, because these things happen. Until like a couple years ago, I was walking around and I had it in my head that like, yeah, Jaws Unleashed is the best game ever made, there's so much cool stuff. I was wrong. So I scooped the F.E.A.R.s up and I took a stroll down memory lane. Yeah, F.E.A.R 2 is still dope. It falls short of the original in enough ways that I can actually agree with the masses that it's technically inferior, but I've seen more than one YouTube smart guy try to paint this as like a shameless, soulless, incompetent cash grab, which is so fucking retarded and disingenuous that even if it's just for my sake, I want to give an honest review. And I think it's important to draw the distinction again that I am not saying F.E.A.R 2 doesn't have a slew of what could be considered shortcomings or questionable design choices, because there are in fact a few choices made by this game that even I won't muster a defense for, but rather that a certain contingent of the populace has blown them way out of proportion, probably due to a romanticized memory of its predecessor. Now hold on, this is not going to be a video about tearing down F.E.A.R 1 in an attempt to prop up F.E.A.R 2, because A, F.E.A.R 1 is fucking awesome, and B, doing so simply isn't necessary in order to highlight F.E.A.R 2's strengths. I think it stands quite well on its own. We just need to look at the age-old comparisons between the two in a more balanced way. And just one more note before we start, I promise. The earliest draft of this video included a shitload of clips from other reviewers making what I considered to be bad or misleading points, which I would then respond to. You know, the kind of thing you'd probably expect from a defense video. That angle kinda ended up getting scrapped for a number of reasons. Most F.E.A.R 2 reviews are several years old at least, which just makes it weird. There's the dreadful state of copywriting on YouTube right now. And also, it just felt a little more antagonistic towards random people than I really want to be, at least when it comes to this specific niche topic. So I just state these takes in my own words. To anyone who's seen or read reviews of the game, it should be clear that I'm not building straw men. Everything I argue against has been said by at least a few prominent reviewers, but I can acknowledge that the decision might make the video less engaging for some. We'll have to live with that. Alright, let's go. F.E.A.R 2 makes most of the expected graphical and environmental improvements that you'd probably expect from a sequel released 4 years later. There's more set dressing in every room, a more varied slew of environments, the horse set pieces are quite a bit more stylized, but there is one valuable component of F.E.A.R that did not make a return. It's dynamic lighting. And when we hop in our mental time machines and look back to 2008, the most consequential year of development, I think we can understand the bargain that caused this. This was a time when cranking the Soldier Boy and then spending several prepaid minutes to call and tell your friends about it on your keyboard phone was the coolest thing a human being could possibly do. We were fucking Neanderthals, and game devs were no different. Environments in F.E.A.R looked unnaturally barren even for the time, because this was pretty much the only way to make the dynamic lighting so effective. It simply wouldn't have been possible to make the lighting interact with 40 additional assets in every room, and I think time has shown us that the developers made the right call. The technological situation during F.E.A.R 2's development was unfortunately pretty similar, owing additionally to the fact that it was being made for the console generation of the time. The team decided not to make that same compromise the second time around, so the result is more immersive environmental decoration, but less immersive ambience because actual dynamic lighting is far more sparse. So the environments do fall a little more flat in many cases. Yes, I think this was the slightly inferior choice. It doesn't bother me as much as other people, but it is a valid criticism. It's just one of those things where I hear people talk about it and they want to paint it as like, oh, Monolith was just being lazy, which doesn't make sense if you think about it, but a lot of people will take that at face value. And even separate from the aesthetic impact of lighting changes, F.E.A.R 2 went in a different direction as far as the color scheme and shading. Everything looks a bit softer this time around. You don't have near as many of the sharp contrasts in second-to-second play. And native lighting is everywhere. This world fucking glows. That obviously doesn't mean it never gets dark though, and ironically I think this lends itself really well to the horror sequences where intense lighting and color contrast does come into play, because things really do pop out at you. Not even in a jump scare way, just naturally. Enemies glowing during slow-mo is silly though. I know they were trying to be helpful, but that's where it stands out to me as a little bit much. So I want to look at a few of the minor aesthetic changes F.E.A.R 2 made. The first is blood effects. From the footage, you can see the enemies here like to explode into this massive strawberry jam, while back in the OG it was much more of a misty cloud. And this is obviously completely subjective territory. I actually like the jam a lot. When I think about the kind of experience a F.E.A.R game is trying to be, I think it's perfect. But I get the impression most people disagree, and that's cool. This is not a hot button issue. What can get a little more contentious is when we're talking about particle effects and environment interaction. When you destroyed shit in F.E.A.R, you truly destroyed it. Like every environmental object was a bomb in disguise and it erupted into flying parts and floating fibers. This brought a sense of intensity to combat encounters and a sense of power to the player, because combat would leave every room a crumbling ruin and every bullet seemed to make a real impact no matter where it landed. These particle effects are still present in F.E.A.R 2, but they've definitely been toned down into something a little more grounded, you could say. Electronics aren't going to explode in a storm of electricity and send bits of glass and plastic across the map. They're just going to kind of make a popping sound and turn off. Or do nothing sometimes. Those are fucking disappointing. For a sequel that was clearly trying to have some fun, I'm definitely inclined to call this a miss. I'm not a developer myself, but I would say it's probably a compromise that had to be made for the sake of not bricking consoles. So if you watch any popular video critiquing F.E.A.R 2, they will almost inevitably state that the game's AI has been somehow downgraded from the first game. I can only possibly excuse this as being the result of someone relying on their positive memories of F.E.A.R rather than going back and actually playing it before they talked about it. Outside of a minor decrease to their accuracy, because yes, enemy gunmen in F.E.A.R 2 do seem to be less accurate as a trade-off for there typically being more of them per combat encounter, which is of course a conscious design choice and not a matter of AI functionality anyway, this statement is just fucking objectively incorrect. Both generally and when forced into similar environments, the AI behaves almost identically. They have a realistic fear of death and will utilize cover intelligently, they'll alternate fire and try to flank you, they'll try to flush you out of your own cover with grenades. The enemies in F.E.A.R 2 actually use this tactic far more often and are far more precise with their throws. Dumb talking points and throwaway lines that get spread around like this honestly aggravate me just a little. The game review genre on YouTube is just incredibly cannibalistic, so one successful video says something that sounds vaguely credible or smart, and it just gets spread to countless channels like a cancerous wildfire without anyone actually thinking about it critically. But anyway, F.E.A.R 2's AI is more than fine. It's quite good actually, but I think some of the critics are trying to make a fair point. Some of the enemies will be easier to line up and gun down or catch out in the open because of how the levels are designed and how combat encounters are staged. In F.E.A.R 2, you're pushed into a great amount of defensive combat scenarios where you're being actively pursued. So you arrive in an area and enemies come to meet you. And this is often in somewhat realistic environments with larger gaps between environmental obstacles. In the original, you find yourself in a higher percentage of offensive combat scenarios, where you'll enter an area that the enemy team is already roaming, and you might have more of a choice in how the firefight is initiated if you avoid detection. And the areas are clearly designed as combat arenas first and foremost, with the goofy, cluttered architecture to match. And this is not a dig on F.E.A.R. This was great, and yes, I think superior in minor ways, but I can't help but notice that the general attitude towards the sequel pretends the combat encounters have to play out a lot different than they actually do. Since you'll often be staged in the room as enemies enter, yes, you can train your sights on the entrances and do everything in your power to stay in cover like it's Gears of War, because the game will let you. You can also start throwing your endless supply of grenades and zip around the room with your shotgun out while enemies rush to find cover and flank you, because you can fucking slow down time after all. I'm not usually the type of guy to tell people they're playing a game wrong, mostly because I'm awful at them myself, but something seems really off when I hear people ragged on the combat here as being a boring cover shooter. Not only does it sound like their criticisms, to an extent, could just as easily be aimed at the original if you chose to play that way, like it's really disingenuous to imply that enemies in F.E.A.R were never standing in the open and late to shoot and essentially just served as a meat balloon for your power fantasy to unfold upon, but it seems like certain gamers made a conscious choice to play as safe and as mundane as possible, ignoring obvious hints from the AI like the fact that they constantly frag you out of cover in an attempt to get you to move around the arena, and then they blamed the game because it made it possible for them to do so. Like, they gave you the fucking Bugatti keys, but you chose to crab walk to work, and then you blamed them because they didn't drive you there themselves. That's not a good analogy at all. But there is a caveat that it would be dishonest to not mention in this context. The player's base movement speed is a little slower here, because they implemented this short burst sprinting mechanic. And I throw this in the pile of changes where I'm like, yeah, it's probably worse, but not a huge deal. The sprint really doesn't contribute much to the experience. I do think it's a little ass backwards. I'm of the perspective that F.E.A.R 2 gave players a little more choice in how they engaged with the enemy outside of when to initiate the fight, which I see as a good thing in most ways. I'll expand upon that with a little more nuance here in a minute. You even just heard me imply that players who found the game boring are playing it wrong, which is super condescending and cunty, and it's almost hard to stand by that opinion when I'm faced with design choices like a movement speed decrease. Yeah, in F.E.A.R 2, you can play it like a clown closet cover shooter, or treat it like Doom, or many styles in between, but when you cut down movement speed and then put the player in larger arenas, which makes their slower speed stand out even more, I can see how players would get the impression that they're supposed to take a meek approach to combat. And I think the game gives you more than enough hints in the opposing direction as well though, which is why this is a caveat and not a point against the game. You're also not that much slower. If you haven't played both, you can just compare footage. It really doesn't seem like as big a deal as it's made out to be by some, but it's definitely worth mentioning. You're going to see more enemies out in the open in F.E.A.R 2 because, again, there are notably more enemies per combat encounter on average. But the easy kills you secure on the guys that didn't find cover fast enough or who decided to move up on your position because they have a shotgun and you wouldn't fucking move, they don't negate the combat experience with the rest of the enemies who are sinking into cover, communicating, trying to frag you out, and operating near identically to how they did in F.E.A.R 1. It's like the entire second half of every shootout gets wiped from people's memories the second they decide to talk about it. And when it comes to enemies running out in the open, that's a genuine point. I'm not taking that away from anyone, but they tend to ignore important factors in why that happens. So when I think of F.E.A.R firefights, I think of the intensity of maneuvering in those spaces. It's great. When I think of F.E.A.R 2 firefights, I think of the greater scale of every encounter, where you get the power fantasy mowdowns, the tense peeks from cover and timed shots, and the slow motion gore parade all in one go. Alright, we're almost done with this fucking section, thank God. I just want to flesh out my blanket perspective on the combat a little more clearly. I do think there's something very positive to be said about a game that requires the player to meet its challenge on its terms, at least when the game is well made. And this was undoubtedly more so the case in the original F.E.A.R than its sequel. Yes, there were a lot of flavor options to the violence, but there were also fundamental aspects of confronting that AI in those environments that stayed consistent and had to be studied to really succeed. And I'm a big fan of this design philosophy. If a game like Sekiro lets you unlock a fucking shotgun or roam around with companions, suddenly the incredibly tight and engaging gameplay that makes it one of the best in its genre is lost on many people. I think F.E.A.R 2 has the means to be every bit as cathartic as its predecessor in the majority of combat scenarios, because I just fucking played them back to back and they can feel very similar. But that approach is not forced on the player. The game does not maintain that same philosophy. Little by little, the more open environments, the reduction in enemy accuracy, the slower movement, better long-range options, they all seem to have nudged many players towards cheating themselves out of a really good time. So in transitioning from F.E.A.R to its sequel, two gameplay changes are going to stand out to you immediately. One is that F.E.A.R 2 allows you to aim down the side of your gun, and the other is that they took away your ability to lean. I'm going to start by talking about the change that I don't think sucks. Aim down sights, or ADS as we pros say, is exactly what the fuck it sounds like. I very much doubt that anyone watching this even needs an explanation, but we'll do it just in case. In F.E.A.R, you couldn't actually look down the sight of your weapons, you just used a crosshair. In F.E.A.R 2, you have the option of using your weapon sight or the crosshair. It's now up to you. And the ADS portion is another really subjective topic in my mind, but I've been made aware that some people fucking despise that you could aim down your gun in F.E.A.R 2. I think mostly because they feel like it made hipfire obsolete and that's how they prefer to play. And that's reasonable. ADS is definitely going to be the most effective method for dealing with enemies at farther distances now. If you're staying relatively still or you're using slow-mo, I'd say bursted hipfire is more than viable at almost any distance you'll encounter enemies at though. So it doesn't really grate on me because I like alternating between the two, and it makes hipfire feel more badass for my simple, childlike brain when it is appropriate. What I can't really find the justification for though is the removal of a leaning mechanic. It is 100% a loss in my mind to not include it. Not just because it was a central factor in avoiding damage in the original, but because it's tactical and cool. I guess this could be another result of its multi-platform release, but that doesn't get them off the hook for anything, just to be clear. Like, this game on the highest difficulty is a fucking nightmare. You take crazy damage from every bullet, and one of the best methods we had for not getting shot is absent. This is one of those areas where I think it rightfully lives in Daddy's shadow, because if F.E.A.R hadn't shown me the fun of leaning, it wouldn't even occur to me that F.E.A.R 2 would benefit from it. But as is, the loss is noticed. I've said once or twice on this channel that the shotgun makes the shooter, or something to that effect. And no, that's not a running meme, it's a well-established school of thought that I am merely a disciple of. A zealous disciple. And so it's with pain in my loins that I chalk up another L for F.E.A.R 2. But hold on, it's not as egregious as many would claim. The shotguns in this game still pack a bit of a punch when you're getting up in enemy faces. You can still make a big pile of jam with a point-blank headshot. But it just pales in comparison to the inhumane, sacrilegious devastation of its predecessor. The damage is down, the ragdolling is neutered. Where's my fucking red Misc machine? Even the gun sounds don't feel quite as weighty or powerful. This was just not the way to make the game world feel more grounded. As for most of the weapons though, I'm not sure there's a very solid basis for bashing them. I mean, the pistol obviously isn't great unless you're within punching distance anyway, but you'll stop using it almost immediately. The SMG and assault rifle feel great, the nail gun is wonderful. The rocket launcher now launches a single rocket instead of 3, which sounds like an obvious downgrade at first, and aesthetically it definitely is. But the rocket seems to reach its target a little faster while doing very similar damage, so I actually prefer it. Then there's the sniper, and F.E.A.R 2 sniping is great. I think they took all of that oomph that they extracted from the shotguns and they loaded that shit into this baby. This is where the punch is. They also put a BFG in the game, it works as intended. The laser does great damage against the mechs, and it's a fun spectacle against the grunts, but you won't see a ton of it. And then there's the flamethrower, which only pops up like twice, maybe? And it's full on booty cheeks, unfortunately. I would absolutely prefer it weren't even here. I don't know how they fucked the goat so hard on this, it should be like the best weapon. But again, it appears very sparingly, and you'll never actually need to use it at all. And that's our firearms. The last weapons we have to discuss are Sergeant Beckett's big meaty hands. I sincerely almost forgot this was a facet of combat. You might have noticed from my footage that I actually mapped the melee attack to fucking Y. Yeah, I really don't use it very much. And it's not because it's unusable or anything, I really didn't melee much more often in F.E.A.R 1 when it was conveniently mapped to right click either. I just prefer when gun go bang. I did use it enough to get a sense for it though, and it feels different this time around. I think the melee hitboxes in F.E.A.R 2 have been shrunken down a bit. In contrast to F.E.A.R, where I don't think I ever missed a melee attack, even when I maybe should have based on character models, you kind of have to be fucking inside of the enemy to be sure your hit will land in F.E.A.R 2. I don't think it spills over into being jank in most cases, but it's just not terribly viable outside of highly specific circumstances. Yeah, the mechs are pretty cool. So here we've got a few minor changes that I was too lazy to fold into another category, so we'll just rattle them off here. Your flashlight now has unlimited battery that will only waver in spooky sequences where it's scripted to flicker. I think this is a positive change. The weird battery life system for the flashlight in F.E.A.R never really seemed like it was adding anything. You now carry 4 guns at a time. That's a clear improvement in my book, minor as it may be. Then there's grenade cooking. You might remember F.E.A.R grenades would explode on impact with an enemy, or just roll around for a set span of time if they didn't touch one. I like grenade cooking. Even if it's less unique than the original's grenades, that doesn't make it worse, right? It adds that super basic layer of strategy, and it gives you a little more control over detonation at the expense of removing the failsafe of guaranteed damage for hitting the enemy. And medkits. The medkit carrying capacity has been plummeted from 10 down to 3. They're divvied up around the map thoroughly enough that gameplay-wise you really don't feel that difference as much as you would expect, but I like that it makes them feel more valuable. Oh god. F.E.A.R lore is fucking mental, guys. Thankfully, because this game happens at like the same time as F.E.A.R and Extraction Point, if you have the world knowledge from those games, you're pretty much set as far as a foundation goes. But just in case, we're going to run through a highly abridged summary of F.E.A.R 2's story and the overarching lore so you can get an understanding of the vibe. If you're already familiar or don't really care, the timestamp to skip to will be on screen. So, Armacam Technology Corporation is still fucking around and being cartoonishly evil. Alma just blew up a fucking city, which makes for a pretty little cutscene. And Sergeant Beckett is tripping telepathic balls on his way to apprehend Genevieve Aristide, the president of Armacam. He passes out like a little bitch, and Aristide has him injected and outfitted with all these cool new telepathic pheromones, which should attract Alma. Huh. She's on your side though, don't worry. This also gives Beckett access to Point Man's slow-mo powers. Through your uninvited contact with Armacam scientist called Snakefist, you'll learn that Beckett is the key to destroying Alma, and so begins your quest to do so. Armacam mercenaries are out in force at this point, trying to cover everything up, and there's fucking replica assholes, and little ghouls, and mechs, and ghosts, puppet master guys, electric assassins, and Alma to contend with. It's quite the roster. There's a cast of eccentric villain personalities to meet and beat, and Beckett's team will stay by him till the end, which will come soon for all of them. Except Sergeant Morales. Nice. In a silly turn of events, the president of the giant evil company wasn't on your side. She fucks up the Alma murdering plan and kills your lieutenant because she needs Alma alive for resume reasons. Then, with you strapped into a big gay chair, she tries to feed you to Alma and lock both of you away in a weird chamber. But it backfires on her because Alma loves you, and then she shows it.
Ah, you came. How delightful.
This ending gets talked about so much more than I really think is warranted. I'm definitely not saying it's unremarkable, but there's just a sea of bad takes about it. If someone doesn't like it, that's totally cool, understandable, who cares? But what I can't abide is this bad habit people have of calling the ending cheap. Like, do you know what that word means? I think they could mean two different things when they say that, and of course the people who say things like this can't be bothered to explain their fucking nonsense, so we'll look at the possibilities ourselves. Claim number 1 is its cheap sex appeal. And I know this video opened with a joke about Alma's weird sex appeal, but you understand that the framing of that bit is from the perspective of a preteen boy. That's why it works. If you, as an adult, play through this game and your take is actually, why are they trying to give me a boner? Get some help, dude. The emaciated telepathic ghost corpse that murdered all your friends shouldn't have you bricked up. You should be unsettled and probably even feel a little bad for her. I don't know. Look at you. She could do better. Then there's claim number 2, its cheap shock value. But what's the shock exactly? That they did a sex? They clearly telegraph Alma's intentions to you very early on in the game, and they don't let up. It should not come as a shock to anyone that has ears or eyes. And I feel the need to reiterate this bit because of how egregiously this gets framed. The ending of this game is the proper culmination of hours of storytelling setup. It doesn't come out of nowhere, it's not fucking random. It's exactly what the game told you would happen if things went wrong, and they did. Or right, I guess, depending on your sick gamer fantasies. That's pretty much my 2 cents on the ending. I certainly don't think it's the pinnacle of storytelling, but I cannot understand why people latch onto it in the way they do. What I find more interesting is how the storytellers here really leaned on juxtaposition. And for the people who think it's to a fault, I will not say they're wrong, but again, many will compare it to the original in a skewed way. So the story and presentation in F.E.A.R 2 is undoubtedly darker than the original in many ways. More horrific violence, more crimes against humanity, the expanding upon Alma's life story is told in tragic, appalling detail. It's more so just making good on the promise of the original, though. They expanded the story without much in the way of curveballs. It's about what you'd expect if you played through the first one. Things have gotten worse. But this darkness is undercut to a greater extent than in the original by your posse of mouthy mercs, action set pieces that completely separate themselves from horror, and some truly cringe 2000s era humor. The extent to which this disruption of the darker atmosphere will detract from the experience will be up to the individual player, of course, but it's definitely not an objectively bad approach. Easy example, look at a film like Predator, which I've legitimately never heard a human being speak negatively about. I mean, I know that movie snobs with bad taste exist, I just don't talk to them. Anyway, the first third of that movie is a by-the-numbers bombastic 80s action flick, complete with buddy humor and countless one-liners. Even after the horde creeps in, there will still be several epic bro moments up to the conclusion. This is of course seen as good juxtaposition, where the power fantasy of large-scale casual violence and jokes is subverted by the confrontation with an unimaginable horror. Do I think F.E.A.R 2 is as good at telling a story as Predator? No. But I think it's playing in the same ballpark. And I find it weird how this is seen as such a major shift away from its predecessor when F.E.A.R was clearly doing a lot of the same things. The attempts at humor don't pop up quite as frequently, but they're there, and given that F.E.A.R 2 devotes quite a bit more time and attention to horror sequences and set pieces, I think the ratio is actually about on par. You play as a ludicrously badass grunt with access to ridiculous weapons and silly kung fu moves in both, and despite all your badassery, you're still pretty much helpless against the horrors you face. But I can acknowledge that I have a biased favoritism towards entertainment that juggles conflicting tones. Anyone who knows me in person probably wishes I'd shut the fuck up about Lisa already, but I just love writing that wants to balance a variety of emotions in interesting ways, even if it stumbles a bit. With that said, I think it'd be a disservice if we didn't close the video talking about our central antagonist and the area where I think the writers made the most noteworthy improvements, Alma. So the cat's out of the bag. The foundation of the story here is that Alma has a crush on you. And this is another one of those juxtapositions we were talking about, but one that's a little less stark. Alma is still horrifying, even more so. She tears apart members of your team and anyone in her way with effortless cruelty. She stalks and harasses you, and you spend the bulk of the game wading through the destruction and massive loss of life she's caused. And despite that, they've managed to make her not just a mildly sympathetic villain, but a downright endearing one, without ever taking away from the evil she's become. She very clearly wants Beckett to understand and like her back, but for reasons I think we all understand, she's not all that socially adept. She's like a homeschooled kid times 2, if you can even imagine. She shows you the atrocities committed against her in an attempt to bring you to her side. She'll occasionally kill the men who are coming for you in order to protect you, and she does this little transforming bit where she goes from her standard Schmiedel-looking self into this ridiculous big-lipped seductress to try and impress you. Making that connection that her running up in what seems like an attack is actually her deranged attempts to seduce and comfort you is so fucking weird and sad and kind of cool. It definitely wasn't impossible to sympathize with Alma and F.E.A.R, but the player's connection with her this time around is strengthened dramatically. You should still probably feel like she needs to die because, holy shit. But it's not an epic bro win, it's more like the best choice in an awful situation. I'm sure most of us have heard that the creators of F.E.A.R originally wanted to make the series more of an anthology, with F.E.A.R teams combating new horrors in every installation. I can't say I'm not incredibly curious as to how that approach would have worked out, but if they were going to continue to expand upon the story of Alma, which obviously they did, I'm not sure it could have been done better than this. Both as a character herself and as a presence in the world, I think F.E.A.R 2 pushed her forward brilliantly, when they very easily could have played it safe and relied on tried and true tropes, while probably being commended for it. Alright, looking at the script, I'm pretty sure this video has been an absolute fucking tank, at least by this channel standards, so if you're still here, I appreciate it a ton. Even if you think I'm wrong and you're planning to call me all sorts of names in the comments, I appreciate you. If you have any questions or suggestions to throw my way about the video or the channel, I'd be more than happy to consider them and chat about it. Other than that, look out for the next one coming some undisclosed amount of time from now, and I'll talk to you guys later.